This is Negotiatex TV.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on the Negotiatex podcast. We are continuing our conversation with Max Bevilacqua. Did I say that right, Max?
It sounded even more beautiful when I say it, yeah.
All right, perfect. The Chief Negotiation Officer of Max Negotiating, a negotiation advisory and training company supporting cyber, humanitarian, and environmental negotiations. If you haven't already checked out part A of this episode, be sure to do that first. Let's jump into the conversation with Max. So Max, you started a podcast that's focused on those of us who train these materials. How is this going, and what are some of those key points that you shared with your listeners?
It's going terribly, Nolan. Just kidding. No, it's great. It started really just as a social thing. So I have my co-host Gwen Krause, and both at Max Negotiating and in the podcast we're expanding, meaning that the name will likely change as well. But it really started because, when I was at Vantage, one of my responsibilities was working with the trainer community. And I loved that. It's having these conversations. It's talking about our experiences on the road, as well as what we learned, sharing our wins and our not as much of wins in the training room. And I think that's where the real learning is, right? And that's where the real humility is. And I miss those conversations. And because of COVID and not traveling or having those after the training dinners together, I wanted to keep those conversations going and also that community going, because of the feeling that there's so many of us that are inspired in a similar way. And if we were, at different parts of the table, representing different organizations, I have a lot of faith in us to collaborate and to do good things. And so I'm very interested in continuing the community of, whether you want to call it the Harvard Negotiation Project or the Program on Negotiation or its many branches. I wanted something that was a container or a space for people to continue developing as trainers, because we're not done developing. And it's also awkward being a younger person feeling like I needed to go out on my own, but not feeling like I have attained expertise, right? I'm still developing and still need mentorship, as I think many of us do. So right now it's kind of this morphed into also a little bit of like a self-led training circle as well, both to come on the podcast and talk about your experiences and what you've learned and to break it down and to kind of expose people to the vocabulary and language of principle or interest-based negotiation, and also to lead sessions in something that they're interested in relative to negotiation. Because for me, the field ought to include, or does include, a much larger amount of literature than I think is accepted within the traditional canon. And I think I've mentioned some of that with family therapy and stuff. One of the people we work with, who I'm a big fan of, Jody Shire, was a Cambridge area family therapist that Roger Fisher watched do some trainings and then adopted that to the IPS exercise. And that, for me, this interpersonal skills exercise was one of the most powerful things. It's essentially Gestalt therapy. And my feeling is also, as we move to the legal corporate sales piece of thing, we lose some of the most powerful pieces of the negotiation and forget that it is a matter of the heart as well as the mind, even if it's not sexy to market it that way. So I don't know if that was responsive to your question. I'm just
that's great.
And I think it's so necessary. It was interesting because I just recently saw Gwen, so a shared colleague there. And we had the conversation, which is the power being in the room with a fellow trainer when we do these, is that the way you present something, maybe a shift, even if it's small, but a lot of times it's not, from the way that I've done it 1,000 times. And I just had this experience with another co-trainer recently, and in the way that she did something around the ladder of inference was different than how I typically approach it. And she kind of backed into it versus kind of leading folks into it. And I thought it was really helpful to create that aha moment. And I said, I'm stealing that, right? And as you said before, as we get more comfortable with, hey, is it mine? Is it yours? Who's, it doesn't matter who, where it came from. If we're getting it out there and we're helping people more effectively influence the dialogue, that's again what I interest about your podcast, which certainly connect folks there, make sure we make the connection. And part of having you on here is to, the reason that Nolan and I do this is let's get more folks from diverse perspectives and thoughts and create this great dialogue and kind of this, in that encyclopedia or library of different thought leaders. So that's available to folks.
Amen. And I think not only is co-training so wonderful because it's a way of getting that development, another pair of eyes that's watching you, that can give you feedback, as well as learning from another trainer, which is, happens in every session. The idea of having two trainers mirrors family therapy, mirrors the co-facilitation, which is meant to be a corrective experience for the parent, for parents, right? So to some degree, you're telling people how they should communicate, but having two people modeling it is more sticky and useful than actually telling people. So I remember that, again, in my negotiation workshop experience, I remember the way that the professor and the TA spoke to one another. That's what I remember, and that's where I take my cues from. Not like you need to active listen, right? Like that's just not as powerful as seeing it. So I think negotiation needs to be demonstrated, not told or taught. And co-facilitation helps you do that with, again, something that I think is a corrective experience to the way maybe you hoped your parents spoke to each other.
Right. That's a really good point, because if you've ever been in the room with somebody else, it's however long that program lasts, it's constantly a negotiation as you work that. Getting into kind of some of the specifics, if folks go to your website, the 7-element model that we've seen from Vantage and others, comes up. I'm just curious, as you teach and train this material, are there certain concepts that you find more sticky or less sticky, or more difficult to train or teach, especially as you look back maybe after this semester? Why do you think that is? Why are there certain concepts that are harder for folks to grasp?
Yeah. I think the 7 elements is probably the best we have. I believe first in designing it differently. So as you may have seen, I have like a periodic table vibe going on. And the reason is because the weight of the elements and their properties are different. I think people struggle with it at first because it's abstract, and also specifically because the communication element carries way more weight than it really ought to linguistically. It's just, it's process, it's time, it's so many things that I think it really, we get stuck in relationship communication, which my understanding, this was the genesis for difficult conversations after getting to yes, was okay, relationship and communication are much more complex. Bruce's circle of value is an amazing, simple, basic, strategic prescription to say, generally speaking, you're going to be in good shape if you're here. I love that. And also delineating integrative bargaining from the distribution, alternatives, and commitment is great. With that being said, I think it's a really helpful organizing tool for trainers. And I don't think it's super intuitive for students as much as I'd like it to be, because I love it. It's how I organize all of the tools. It's the super structure. Yep, right. Stakeholder mapping goes within relationship. Attachment theory goes within relationship. Tone of voice, communication, ladder of inference is the first thing you should do under communication. So I think if you have 7 elements in ladder of inference, you're ready for the rest of your life to keep going. There's some, I'm going to butcher this, but there's some philosopher like Heidegger or someone, and he went to one of his teachers, or someone came to him and said like, okay, I've been like reading Aristotle for like 10 years, which I do now. And he was like, read it for 40 more. Right. The idea is that like we have enough stuff. We have enough intellectual property. I think the concepts are good, but we need to be very aware that it comes from white collar negotiation. Right. Like I also do work in prisons. I dare you to speak that way, like using objective criteria in a prison. Good luck. Right. So I think to some degree we have intellectualized, the models are helpful because they intellectualize things. But for many of us, myself included, that's a defense mechanism from actually being present and connected, right? Oh, I know how to do this, right? And sometimes what someone is asking for is you to just be present and to listen to them. So I think there's an irony that we're kind of model and framework obsessed. But I do think that, if you're trying to learn negotiation, you need to know the 7 elements. And if someone has their new take on it, great. Yeah, I know we all need to sell stuff, but generally speaking, I believe that everything fits into those. Though again, the reason for a periodic table is to say that the relationship and communication elements are so heavy. And if they were to be displayed graphically, they ought to be bigger, if that makes sense, right? The idea that they each have equal weight, that they're 1/7 of a negotiation is wrong. Yeah,
that's a nice insight. And I like the kind of illustrative nature of you putting it on a periodic table and talks about weights and properties. Can you give us a little bit more? You said you go into prisons.
Aram, I've given you enough. I've given you both enough. I'm just kidding. Yeah, absolutely.
I love it. How do you reframe the conversation when you go in to a prison? Since talking objective criteria doesn't work, can you give us a little bit of that, what that sounds like?
Sure. So one of my other heroes besides Roger Fisher is Dr. James Gilligan, who is the husband of Carol Gilligan, who wrote In a Different Voice when, most of the psychological literature was really just from the perspective of men. So he's the husband, and he, and people are gonna have to fact check me here, but he was in some capacity put in charge of running prison hospitals or mental hospitals and prisons. And my understanding is that, so he's written several books. One of them is Violence: Reflections on a National Epidemic. And his findings were basically that violence is like a disease and the pathogen is shame. So you can make it more likely when you have people socialized as male from low socioeconomic status, meaning that they don't have other avenues for self-esteem, and that violence comes from being dissed or disrespected. Right. And that shame, it's a response to overwhelming shame, the type of shame that you cannot live with, that causes either self-mutilation or the mutilation of others as kind of an expression. And that's the other idea, is that violence is destructive and random sometimes in terms of war and battlefield. But when it's personal in terms of homicide and suicide, it's expressive. It has a language of its own. And so these are the types of conversations I believe should be in the negotiation field. So when I was an undergrad, I did like GED tutoring in a detention facility. I connected through Elise Willer, who's one of our amazing colleagues, connected to this guy named Ben Lidauer, who runs the Jericho Circle Project. And what the Jericho Circle Project does is it takes its inspiration from what's called the Inside Circle. There's a documentary called The Work. And basically what they do is people come to the prisons, and when I'm in the prison, I'm not leading anything. I'm one of the participants. I'm one of the participants showing up in a circle, doing my own work and trying to get over the fact that, like, I've had a lucky life and like, oh, I'm from the poor side of a yachting town, etc. You show up and you do your work, and that's the way you honor the people around you. And like, there's psychodrama. It's IPS. You could be enrolled as the inner child of someone who's being abused, right? You help people do that work and work through. And what you find, which is, maybe not surprising, but can be startling, is you're not better than anyone. You're not worse than anyone, right? Like, these are people, and they respond in ways that like maybe you would have responded. And so just like ransomware, you start to find, like, I would call this negotiation or negotiating with self or facilitated negotiation with self, which is just self-development. And I think that dovetails with leadership and all of that. But I think just like in the cyberspace, I don't want to just be in the situation when things are bad. I'd love to talk about our wasted potential in prisons. Like talk about a human capital waste. Yeah. The United States needs, like, oh my God, like there is genius in prisons and there's criminality outside of them. And so, I'll leave it there. But for me, there's an idea that I learned in religious studies, which is that the things that society pushes to the farthest out to the periphery are actually reflective of what's inside of it. Right. So I think prisons are incredibly reflective of our values as a society. And also in terms of our theory of change, if it is a corrections facility, which at least in Massachusetts they're so named, then correct, right? And per our own influence and negotiation literature, that command and conquer and pure power, coercive power, it has the opposite effect. And there's a saying that Gilligan has that he may be quoting someone else, but it's something like, no one feels more innocent than a prisoner. No one feels more guilty than a saint. Or just the idea is that when you punish people, they feel less guilty. And so, yeah, I think there's a larger negotiation in society in terms of the way we view the potential of people. And you look at the prisons, that has to be one of the biggest deadweight losses in society.
Tremendous passion there.
So you also do a fair amount of work around mediation. So I was hoping we could kind of talk a little bit about that, and how do negotiation skills show up when mediating, and what do you find to be different?
I just have to say at this moment, I'm so much more curious in what you both do and how you came to the field. So I just want to, I think you like get the vibe of how I think to some degree. Like, mediating to me is facilitated negotiation, right? It's the pursuit of what we want. And I believe adding extra parties enables there to be an adult in the room, which I think we desperately need in many organizations and departments. But I'm curious how the degree to which you've seen things that are similar, or the way in which you see negotiation phenomenologically is different, or, what's your spin, or what's your school?
Max, I would say that, you and I both know Jeff Weiss and have roots in similar thinking, from Jeff and Bruce and others, who've just invested so much time over the last, what is it now, 40 plus years, probably going 50 years for some of our colleagues. Yeah, and I think what we've heard you share is through experience, saying this works. And as we kind of grow and mature in the process to say, whether we think of them as elements or we think of them as levers, I've got some power that's beyond force and threat. If that's all you had in your kit bag was force and threat, and there's certainly times to use force and threat. Sure. But if that's all you have, then you're going to treat every situation. And there are plenty of situations going into a prison, operating in a family, in business, right? And certainly in where Nolan and I are coming from in the military, where the emphasis on relationship and communication, or deep diving and understanding the power of interests and drivers and what those interests are, especially when they're not being expressed, they're hidden, because they're very personal, and they're around fears and self-protection, and they're not going to be things that are just going to roll off the tongue as you start to try, ask me what's driving me. But we've seen those, in some very difficult situations deployed, and the success of being able to employ these concepts in a way that's consistent with who I am and who we are and how we see the world. To be able to, again, to practice and experience has said, this is real. How do we get others to see that, right? And be able to step outside their status quo, their natural approach, and say, let me try something else that may be a little uncomfortable at first and can yield much better outcomes and results.
What I hear in you were saying that is double loop learning, and just the idea of like, okay, you shouldn't expect different outcomes from the same behavior, and you're not going to have different behaviors just because, some guy in a suit says, try this word, or time it in the morning when your boss is holding a warm beverage, an actual study on receptivity. It comes from like, what are your assumptions, and surfacing those and challenging them. And to some extent, that's also cognitive behavioral therapy. Yeah. Right? Like, what are the relationships amongst your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and how they reinforce each other? Yeah. Exactly. Right. Like, and I think when you talk to people who get it or in this space, you're just like, yep, preach.
And I think that's how we tie it back to NEGOTIATEx, is like through this podcast, hearing just tons of different viewpoints, different thoughts. We obviously have our pretty tight circle of vantage, Harvard lineage and everything like that. But there's plenty of people that bring on the podcast that are not in that same school of thought. And what we like to say is that Aram and I can basically take something from every single person we brought on, even if, we're not rooted in the same teachings or the same philosophy around negotiations. And so, just trying to add more tools to the kit bag, I think is what we're trying to do here. And I think that is the value that we provide to the community. So
I'm so tired of vilifying the vilifying of somebody who just sees the world differently, a different perspective, right? A different conclusion. And you said we're already armed with everything. We are, and there is power in mediation. I agree. It's facilitated negotiation. That's tends how I see it. I think the skills overlap. I know we asked you that. And a lot of times we don't get the benefit of a mediator. It just doesn't exist. I've got to be able to show up and act like a mediator in the situation, and as I'm actually negotiating or discussing. And I think that the limited mindset of what is negotiation or conflict, and when we don't practice these skills intentionally, that gets us into a lot of trouble. So
is negotiation the best word for us to unite? Like, we've both doubled down to some degree, Max negotiating and NEGOTIATEx. But was that a mistake for us?
You've obviously thought about it, so I'll turn the question as a good teacher, right? So what do you think, Max?
Great facilitator.
The problem with the word is so loaded for folks, and it immediately triggers, unfortunately, probably the worst experience that every person has ever had in a negotiation. And so it triggers the haggle, the threat, the sometimes you're the bug, sometimes you're the windshield. Sure hope I'm the windshield this time around. It's a great question. I mean, you've thought about this. If you're going to ask, what's your thought on it? Is there a better word?
I think it depends on if you see the word or see like the world normatively or as it is, like the way that it should be or the way that as it is. As it should be, I believe that negotiation is the right concept. Right? It's the right concept. There's a debate in probably many fields, but specifically in religious studies, which is, and warning, unnecessary words coming, but the idea of, is religious studies epiphenomenal? Like, is it actually a real thing, or is it just several other disciplines combined? Or is it sui generis of its own creation? Is it its own thing? I don't think negotiation is its own thing. I think that it's behavioral science, psychology, sociology, et cetera, et cetera. It's an important distinction, and I think it is the right banner for even, the work of your internal voice and communicating with yourself and shadow self and all of that personal work. I think that's within negotiation.
Yeah.
So normatively, it should be right. Sorry, Aram, do you have?
No, it's just that what you just said is a huge shift for so many folks.
Yeah. And so, yeah.
Right? Because I think most folks would say it is its own thing. They wouldn't take the broad perspective that you just described it as and how it's part of these other disciplines.
These are the dangers of a liberal arts education. As the world is, I think it's not the most effective word. And therefore, as negotiators, we probably ought to think about expanding it. I think it's important, and I don't know about for you, but one of the reasons that I do keep negotiation as one of the words is because I want to be involved with the events that people identify as negotiations. I don't want to exclude myself from peace talks and something, et cetera.
I hope that in the process, I mean, as you're doing, right, and we started with this around the cyber and humanitarian and environmental, let's broaden at the same time, right? It does involve conversations, and so much of what it starts with me and how I show up and how, and what's going on in my own mind. I'm curious, you've started this again, just so many endeavors. I'm amazed at what you're doing. The Next Generation Practitioner Circle, this idea that it's to, help a pursuit of Pareto optimality, help create Pareto optimal action solutions. Are these the sort of conversations around what are we defining as negotiation in this forum? Why do you find this forum critical to have these discussions amongst peers?
Yeah. It has a social component that I don't want to underplay. Like a lot of it is just like, look, part of the irony, I think, in the negotiation space is the conflict within it and the fact that it is as fractured as it is. If we talk about collaboration and leveraging shared resources. So this is in some ways an attempt to create a space that isn't a business or capitalized space, that is just, okay, you're people who love this stuff. Let's be together in that. And, as someone who went out on their own, having my colleagues was an enormous source of not just inspiration, but I feel very confident in the things that the type of work we do can do for others, but less so when I'm on my own. Right. And I'm like, oh, what do I even know? So to some degree it has a social component, but also just like when people are traveling around the world right now, like there's some now filtering and functionality where if you're in Brussels, great, you can see which trainers are there. So either you can refer work there if you need to, or you can grab a beer with that person or whatever you drink. But the other space is to continue development. And so that's continued development selfishly for trainers that have a growth mindset, right? That we're still developing. And it's a space where we're trying to create those norms of humility and continued learning. And also to create a space for people who graduate from programs or who are interested in this field to enter. Because from my perspective, where does a negotiation training program belong? Business school, law school, industrial organization? Don't know. I would argue that in terms of, we were talking about in terms of modeling negotiation and training it as opposed to teaching it from a book. What is a BATNA? What is a ZOPA? Which doesn't, I think, to my mind, do much for a negotiator in action. Maybe it doesn't belong in a university, right? And so for me, I'm also thinking about great, what if we just thought about the most rigorous, rewarding training program, right? And and also welcomed people who are trying to get into the field without, kind of going through the classic, you're a teaching assistant, analyst, whatever it may be, which to me is part of the Harvard tradition of rigid hierarchy that doesn't enable the creativity that I think that we need. So in some ways it's meant to be a more egalitarian, we're all trainers, we're all trying to learn, but I'm also very curious about the question, not only what do you think about the word negotiation, but to have it informed by other sessions. So the one that we're having later today is on nonviolent communication, which I think is a huge missing piece in program on negotiation. You're both invited to any and all of these things, and also open to your ideas to them as well, because it really is a group endeavor. But for me, it's a place where we get to ask the questions where we're not constrained by the client, right? Or an organizational hierarchy where people can just say like, hey, I think this is bullshit, or I don't like the way we talk about that, or whatever it may be. It's really to get that feedback that you would get in the room or after a training with a co-trainer, as well as to, hopefully create, if we believe that diversity is a source of value, which I think we should, we need more people in the field and from different backgrounds. And so, I'm part of the traditional group in that I went through university. Right. But if you don't go to a program on negotiation school and you don't have those means or those opportunities, we still need perspective, right? Like, I remember negotiating as a bartender, trying to get my job back after being let go, right? That's a different negotiation. And those are the stresses, specifically when you add financial stress, such a different component, because people's time horizons change, right? Like it's very easy to judge people for like, oh, why do you eat shitty food? Why do you smoke cigarettes? You're trying to get through the day, right? Like different stressors, different things we're walking around with. So we need the perspectives for people that before they turn whatever age you are at grad school, you're having impactful negotiations when you're much younger, but also from places and communities where we don't have great representation and where we're probably not the right people to go into that community and say, hey, here's what, let's do this, right? Like if we believe in the influence that we need buy-in from the parties, then we also need representation from those parties. And Harvard law skews a certain way.
It's about reach and contact points. And I love how you're challenging us to think about how we traditionally do that. And we do have some traditional approaches, both on the academic side and the corporate training side. And we have some colleagues that are doing other things, right? Making it more accessible. Even Dr. Josh Weiss's recent book on, for kids, is another one, right? How do we get these materials into hands earlier? It's a great question, Max.
Josh's work is fantastic. I'm pulling up. It has the book has a great title. I don't want to butcher it, but his new book is great, and I think he has other children's books, and that's exactly the type of stuff we're talking about. I'm like, this is something that we sent around in the Next Generation Negotiation Practitioner Circle, just creative ways of expanding the circle, and that includes an age, right? Let's norm this, because I think an issue that I think we've been dancing around too is that it's hard to negotiate skillfully in a culture or a society that is going to push back on that type of behavior, or is going to say, wow, you're just listening and you're not taking a position publicly. Seems you changed your mind. You're open to persuasion, which we know is the way to be persuasive. You're a flip-flopper. Right? Not that can't happen, but we have a culture. And look, for me, negotiation is a way of coding communication as more masculine. That's it. It's communication, but I think, at least personally, my connotations of like communications majors and marketing and media, it gets diluted and it becomes anti-academic, even soft. And look, at Fletcher, there's a saying that the flagship degree is a MALD, Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy. There are war MALDs and there are peace MALDs. The war MALDs are in security. The peace MALDs are in development. They're both negotiating, right? Maybe security deals more with the alternative of violence, et cetera. But it's to me, it's pretty obviously gendered in the sense of we have different expectations of how hard and legitimate it is, how much you get paid, et cetera, et cetera. So I think negotiation is an easier way to sell communication training. Interesting. At least as a dude.
So Aram and I are always interested in how negotiating skills show up in a person's life, in the personal life. So we always like to ask the question is, how does it show up in your personal life? And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a wide and a deep question. It absolutely has. It changes the way I think about relationships. And I think for me, I used to see relationships as zero sum, right? Like both specifically romantic ones, but others as well, where, if I'm spending time here, that's time away from you, right? And so for me, part of the Negotiators, and this might be a large left turn, but there's a book called The Ethical Slut that I believe belongs in the negotiation literature, and it's mostly about communication and active listening. It's not endorsing polyamory, but it's talking about our definition of resources of love and sex, et cetera. And so I think for me, it's helped me understand that I'm not as interested in relationships where my growing or expanding with other people in other ways comes at the expense of that relationship, right? Like, are there not arrangements in families, in organizations, teams, couples, whatever it may be, that are more Pareto optimal for whatever reason? And do we not sometimes squeeze out creative solutions and create dead weight loss by trying to force things in the same box? So, so for me, I definitely look at relationships a bit differently, and hopefully on a good day as less zero sum and more like, how can we make each other's worlds bigger and better?
Before we kind of get into wrap up, I want to hit one more thing you've been involved in, which is Pathways. Love to hear a little more about what that is, what it's about, why you find that work important too, because I think it's a little different than anything else you've shared so far.
So Pathways is an organization that's led by Avi Goldstein, who's another one of our colleagues at Vantage, and you can kind of see the power of this Roger Fisher discipleship or line of thinking, in that followers go out and start their own things, and this is one of those offshoots. They do really incredible work in terms of training and negotiation stuff in an Israeli-Palestinian context. So they're in Israeli schools. Avi, I also believe, is currently based in Belgium. And so he's working in Belgian public schools, and, not dissimilar from creating children's books, it's targeting people at a younger age, right? People who will become leaders in society and teaching them norms and ways of thinking that are hopefully integrative. It's hard to ignore Israel-Palestine, even though it's very difficult to talk about. I'm an American Jew, even though my father is Catholic and all that family stuff. But so I feel a good amount of responsibility. I think most people can agree, especially, we don't have to get super into it, but with a far right-leaning Israeli government, I mean, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking all around. And you see this tendency, I think, in the US, you see this tendency in Britain, you see it in a lot of spaces and places, this kind of like far right religiosity, which I would argue is antithetical to skillful negotiation, in that it's literal, inflexible, definition orthodox. So it's important for me to be involved in work like that. We also have colleagues at CMP, Ken Hyatt and Nassim and Liz McClintock, that do awesome work at NSI. So I'm tangentially involved and in this space. But honestly, another thing that I negotiate is my identity often, even as a white dude. I have an Italian Catholic father and an American Jewish mother, Ashkenazi Jews. And, what does it mean to me to be a Jew, right? What is my relationship to Israel, right? Do I talk about this publicly? Do I not? Or do I just shut up, right? So there are a lot of internal negotiations that I have. And so negotiation has more than anything been a way for me to more diplomatically deal with myself.
Yeah. It's a nice tie back to the question Nolan had asked you before too, right? Which is, it is about relationships, which can tend to be outward focused. And so much of that comes back to how we're negotiating with ourselves, our identities, and how, who we are, our own mindset. Thank you for the work that you're doing through Pathways. Thanks for all the work. I'm going to turn it over to Nolan to kind of maybe take us into wrap up here.
Yeah, absolutely. So is there anything else that we didn't ask you, Max, that you want to cover as we wrap this podcast episode up?
Or even a key takeaway, Max? Well, if you had one thing to tell our listeners, one thing to tell our students.
So first of all, love the last question of what did we forget to ask? I think that's a great takeaway for anyone, that if you want to make sure that if your intent or purpose is to make someone feel heard, then it's great not just to ask them questions and to listen, but then to ask, what did I not ask? So I think it's a very skillful question. You asked such probing questions that I shared a great deal more than I even thought. So I don't think there's anything there. I do want to just add that, in attributing things that one of the guys that does the prison work, who is instrumental in bringing it from Inside Circle on the West Coast to here, is Steven Spitzer. And I don't think I mentioned that. And so I wanted to do that. There's something ironic in terms of asking for negotiation advice, because if you're not receptive to it, it doesn't mean anything, right? Like, why should you listen to me? Okay, maybe you think because I'm with these strapping military gentlemen that I'm important. Yeah, maybe so. And there are social proving aspects to all of this. So I'd more deeply ask, what do you want? And I think for that alone is a really difficult question, including for myself. What do I actually want? As Bruce says, we have a portfolio of interests, right? I both want to order Domino's and want to look more svelte, right? We have these competing interests and we're negotiating amongst our internal voices. And so I think for me, my question is just like, what do you want? And then the question is, why do you feel uncomfortable asking for it? How does that relate to your self-worth? How do you see the relationship between yourself to yourself and yourself to others? And William Ury does this in Getting to Yes with Yourself in a really beautiful way. But I'm just curious, what do you want?
It's a great way to end this, and greatly appreciate you joining us today, Max. I'm going to kick it over to Aram for closing thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think Max closed it pretty well there. I'll just say that the first thing you talked about was that negotiators are formed in the family crucible. I think that's consistent with everything we've heard through this program with you, and with that last piece. So thanks so much for taking the time. Know you're busy, and thanks for sharing your insights. Look forward to working with you in the near future, Max.
It's just the beginning. So good to meet you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a blast.
That's it for us on today's podcast. If you haven't already, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode. Hey, thanks for checking out this video on Negotiatex TV. If you found any value at all, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification icon if you want to be notified of future videos. And then we also have a couple videos over here that you might be interested in checking out. If you and your small business, your team, are looking to get negotiations or leadership training, then you can head over to negotiatex.com and learn more about the coaching services we offer. Thanks, and I'll see you over in the next video.